And what Iran is saying now is that there will be no discussion on its ballistic missile program, that if there is a ceasefire, Iran is going to move rapidly to continue its ballistic missile program, recognizing that it's its only deterrent against the United States and against Israel.
If you buy what CENTCOM is selling, this is the most accident-prone the U.S. military has been in its entire history. The F-15 entered service 60 years ago and has never been down during a war. Now 5 of them have been down by malfunction and friendly fire in 2 weeks. On March 5th, the IDF claimed to have destroyed 300 Iranian missile launchers. So over the next 2+ weeks of fighting, they only destroyed or disabled 30 launchers. None of it makes sense, especially because they were leaning too hard into either plugging some holes, which they probably successfully did, right? Like the entry points into where these tunnel systems are. And that caused a momentary pause in the volleys that were being launched. Or Iran was actually moving in a different direction and trying to make sure that this was a war of attrition and they could continue doing this for as long as possible. And that's why they were taking pot shots with the cluster munitions that they keep opening up on top of the Israeli airspace. Because you only, as I kept repeatedly explaining, you only do that when your goal is to just like frustrate Israeli society. You're not doing that for any sort of like specific military purpose beyond, pissing off Israeli society, crippling the Israeli economy, forcing them into bomb shelters, because those are not interceptable missiles.
This goes to an argument also that Dylan Saba has put forward. He wrote for Jewish Currents in 2023 that I think is still one of the most powerful interventions I've ever read on anything related to these issues, which was about how Iron Dome is an offensive weapon. And the idea is that Israel's defensive capabilities have been so aggressively beefed up so as to inoculate Israelis from what in any other context would be viewed as like the reasonable costs incurred for fighting a regional war.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
100%.
there is now, and I think in this situation, Iran has finally figured out that like we have taken, I mean, their leaders have arrived at the decision, forced really, that like there's no more respecting that. You have to flood the zone and test the limits of this system. And they've tested it, and they found that actually, like, Israeli leaders are now having to prepare their a family of mine has heard this as well. Like, Israeli leaders are trying to prime the population for the idea that they may not have to, because like all of the Israelis running to the shelter and stuff before, like when Hezbollah would send a rocket, or when Islamic Jihad or Hamas would send a rocket from Gaza and it would land in a field in Beersheba. I mean, you were talking about like almost what was for Israeli leaders, as they saw it, like the perfect level of suffering that they could experience, because it reminded the population of the danger, but it was not enough to actually like destroy and disrupt their quality of life over the course of like year, 2 years, whatever. And having lived in Beersheba, having lived in the south in the Israeli South myself, and at a time when that was the case, like it was very obvious that was the function.
Yeah, that's why when you interview regular folks, ordinary Israeli society, they just have like a totally insane attitude about waging war with Iran, because from their perspective, there's no cost. There's some costs, there's minor nuisances, and I suspect that might change eventually, but I don't know, because like part of me also thinks that, like, just as we saw with October 7, they're fucking insane.
They're insane, but they have like, there's a limit, not a limit to how crazy they are, but like insanity can be checked by reality and certain, like how crazy are you willing to be when your bank account is zero, that kind of, or when it goes to zero and you can't feed yourself. Like there's a certain kind of degree there's a certain element of this to me where like part of what we still have not seen yet is the real stress tests applied, not just to like, Israelis, like everyday Israelis and their everyday happiness and their joy, with bombs and missiles falling on them. It's instead about the question of like, can the Israeli society, can the Israeli polity survive intact in any recognizable form were this war to continue and their economy were to become devastated? Because Israel is not Iran. Israel is a tiny country, and it has a lot of
tiny country
and
size of New Jersey.
Meaning, though, what happens when a lot of those people who have dual citizenship in other countries and have been for the past number of years, even before October. This is a story I've told many times. A very, very influential and well-known Israeli journalist reached out to me. This is well before October 7th, because I had said, on Twitter, I said something like I had informally heard that there were many people who had been, who were leaving Israel because prior to October 7th, the radical government was making a bunch of Israeli libs start to feel, nervous and sketchy. And so if you had a German passport, an American passport, people were starting to move assets. And I'd said, I threw some cold water on that. I was like, I haven't seen the numbers. I haven't seen the statistics. And then this guy out of nowhere, somebody who I don't have a connection to, saw my comment. It was just like, I just want to let you know. And that was prior to October 7th. I would be fascinated if, I would be so curious how, if the conditions in Israel were actually made that much more damaging, if they were that much more destructive to the average Israeli life, what might happen for all of the people who are in Israel who don't necessarily want to stay there. And I think that that's where, again, like we've really not seen, and what I'm describing may be a situation that just like is not really plausible, because Israel would move so aggressively to prevent any circumstance like that from happening in real time. But I think that what I'm really trying to point out is that we've not even seen Israel get tested to that point, and what Iran has been doing in terms of how it is stretching the limits of Israeli defenses is suggesting that, well, maybe we are going to see if that can happen. Maybe we're going to see if that possibility can be breached.
Now let's look at another exit ramp for the world's least loyal man, who has always thrown everybody else under the bus. Perhaps this could be first inclination of who might be in the crosshairs. Let's take a look.
I called Pete, I called General Kane, I called a lot of our great people. We have great people. And I said, let's talk. We got a problem in the Middle East. We have a country known as Iran that for 47 years has been just a purveyor of terror. And they're very close to having a nuclear weapon. We can keep going and get that 50,000 up to 55 and 60 is no end. Or we can take a stop and make a little journey into the Middle East and eliminate a big problem. And Pete, I think you were the first one to speak up. And you said, let's do it, because you can't let them have a nuclear weapon. So we are now having really good discussions. They started last.
I don't know if it'll throw Pete under the bus here. It doesn't seem like it.
Yeah, that sounds like he's giving Pete a pat on the head, I'll be honest.
Yeah.
Because it's like, and I'm sure, a nice hard on going, having gotten that pat on the head.
Yeah. Iran's main demand is communicated to the mediators. If Trump fires Hexit, all bets are off. Moin Rabbani is joking there.
Yeah, it's clear.
Yeah. Breaking. The Speaker of Iran's parliament, who some claim has been negotiated with the U.S., says no negotiations have taken place, and the President Trump is claiming otherwise to manipulate the market. It is crazy that, because it's no longer a non-state actor in the same way that, we very quickly did away with the Iraqi government, right? In the immediate invasion, and we were fighting against not like a fully fleshed out state in the Taliban, in Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, but Iran is a state actor. It's a sovereign state. So you can't, especially with social media, you can't really undermine their position as much as you could, dominate the airwaves when you're talking about Israel versus Hamas.
Yeah.
Talking about Israel versus Hezbollah. You have dudes with 8 PhDs on fucking, the interpretation of Quran from a Western capitalist framework, who are just coming out and posting on social media and also doing interviews in English with American news outlets. All of a sudden, I think that plays a major role. It delivers a major blow to whatever the American goals of propaganda are. Because then mainstream media will cover the Iranian
There's another
posts.
thing, though, which is that it's not just about that Iran's a state, and that Hamas is like a political organization with limited autonomy, whatever. It's that Iran also has the world economy by the nuts. Yeah. That they can do things that force people to take them seriously. Yeah. And it's just literally not been until this wave of this conflict that all of a sudden the West realized it. Because Iran had chosen not to go this far. They made the Iranian government, for whatever reason, much to the criticism of people much to the criticism of Western leftists, for example, they chose not to take it to this level until this most
It was
recent.
undeniable that it was,
Until Trump said we're coming to kill all of you.
I think this was Yahya Sinwar's calculation. It's just that both Hassan Nasrallah and Khamenei were far more restrained than he thought they would be. That's what I think.
Meaning, like in the prior conflicts, meaning that he
Yes.
thought it would come to this earlier.
I think that the purpose of the Al Aqsa flood was to trigger was to trigger an Iranian retaliation of this sort.
I think it's plausible. I think one of the things, though, is that like there's always this kind of, and this is like also what Israel's deal was, is that they're always like testing the limits of what they think they can get away with. Because I also think, in some sense, what you're describing is that, like, yes, they wanted to provoke some kind of response, but now we're in a dog getting the car situation. And like, I think that they actually knew all along that they didn't want that smoke. What they wanted is what they said that they wanted, which is that they wanted the Iranian people to rise up. Like, I also do believe that on some level, these guys have been believing their own bullshit about the closeness of, put it this way. You were just in Cuba. You saw what life was like in Cuba. For 60 years, every American president, save for Obama, has been told by their advisors, "We're this close. You're going to be the president who's going to get to see the Castro regime fall." It's the same thing with Iran. And I think that they ultimately believed their bullshit too much, even if they weren't believing it coming out of the Pahlavi's mouth. Like, they believed it on this, like, deeper level because they literally hadn't been presented with like a counter fact.
Yeah, I mean, Trump, I think other presidents have, not saying much, but even including Biden, like, have at least like demonstrated some level of restraint. Because I believe that Israel behind closed doors was always telling them the same fucking lie. But at least they were like competent enough to listen to their generals and their analysts and their own intelligence assessment to be like, no, we're not fucking doing that. You're out of your goddamn mind. It's too much of a risk, right? Until Trump. I think Trump demonstrated in Trump 1 and also in Trump 2, as we're seeing now, that he was the guy who was going to be like, yeah, no, you guys, your intelligence is great. I love what you did with the beepers, that type of shit.
Yeah.
Running off of like the highs that he got from the Venezuela operation, which was remarkably competent in comparison to what we're seeing in Iran right now. He thought this would be swift. I think he believed
The Maduro thing really got to his head.
Yeah. No, I think he genuinely thought, oh, decapitation, boom, boom, boom. Because I know he does not want to put boots on the ground.
No,
he has never, like, he might inevitably lean in that direction because he's like, he's not going to back away, right?
This one I don't know about, because I also don't think that like you leak that you're considering troops, or you don't allow it to get out that you're considering ground troops, because it's in this current moment. The Iranians will read that as a sign of weakness because they're like, bring that on. If that's the level you're going to, bring it on. And politically, domestically, it's insanely unpopular. So if it doesn't present to Iran as or the world as a show of strength, and it drives the American public crazy, then why are you doing it? And that's where I think that, like, I do hold some measure of judgment on whether or not Trump is actually like opposed to ground troops. We know that he said at different points, like, Iraq, it was a mistake. No new wars. But like,
no, but like,
he's a master liar.
Yeah, but think about it. Like, he didn't do that in Venezuela. He amassed a big enough force to potentially draw Venezuela or go into a much larger conflict in Venezuela. Like, you don't amass that level of naval forces if your goal is not to like eventually take it. If you're not willing to present that as a threat, while simultaneously always done crazy shit. But he has also backed away at times.
I don't disagree, but Venezuela worked also though, because like you saw the Wall Street Journal article about the CIA guy.
Oh yeah, the
who worked
who
worked for Chevron.
Yeah.
Like Venezuela is different from every other country that we've talked to, because American corporation multinationals have had a major like presence in Venezuela for like within the last 20 years. I mean, there are people who are CIA affiliated who worked with Chavez to get oil out of Venezuela into the world market. It's not like meaning that there were connections. There were, I think they had a more realistic portrait of what the situation was in Venezuela and how they could exploit it. It doesn't seem, to me, it just seems like they had the one radical plan that actually had a chance of working because of, the way they did it out and the legwork they did. And Trump's lesson from that was oh, well, I could just do whatever I want now because we did whatever I wanted here, even though that wasn't what they did. They did a pretty specific thing with some limits. And that's not this.
All right, let's hear what Scale's new reporting looks like. Senior Iranian official tells Drop Site News, Jeremy Scale and Mortaza Hussein, there aren't any negotiations taking place. The Iranian side has simply communicated its conditions to the U.S., and even that has been done indirectly, adding that the U.S. messages have also only been passed through intermediary countries.
Debated how to even deal with this, and they literally ghosted Steve Witkoff. They did not respond to him. When we reported that last week, the White House went nuts. They denounced Drop Site News, accusing us of engaging.
Yeah, they said Drop Site News is a terrorist outlet.
In America Last behavior, said we were abhorrent, and then they went and they spun a story to Axios saying that it was actually the Iranians that had been begging President Trump to speak. And so, this kind of played out over the past few days. And what Iranian sources were telling me, Daniel, is that through a series of intermediary countries, including Turkey, Pakistan, Egypt, and also some Gulf countries, there have been a series of messages passed on to the Iranians by the United States where, according to Iranian officials, these third-party intermediaries have said that the U.S. wants to wrap up this war. And that happens while publicly Trump is saying, we're going to bomb Iran's electrical and power infrastructure, which, by the way, would be a war crime if they did that in a sweeping manner. Iran then said, hey, let us tell you what we can do. We can hit not only in Israel, but we can hit in all throughout the Gulf. And this would cause just like catastrophic shock to the global economy, which we can talk about later. But the most breaking stuff I have for you is that Trump today posts on Truth Social that there's been this breakthrough, that he's pausing his threat to bomb the Iranian electrical grid and other energy infrastructure because there have been these talks going on between the United States and Iran. And Trump implies that he has some secret squirrel that he's talking to in Iran, and he doesn't want to name who it is because he doesn't want that person to be killed. It's unclear, does he mean by Israel or by the Iranians, But what I'm told is that there have been no direct negotiations with the United States, and that what the Iranian officials are telling me is that every time a third country comes to Iran and they say the United States wants to talk, Iran says, let us explain to you our conditions. And in short, what the Iranians are saying is that they will not agree to the kind of ceasefire that took place last June after the so-called 12-day war, because the Iranians view that as having been a gimmick to buy the United States and Israel time to rearm, to reposition, and then come back in with this full-blown war that they launched on February 28th. So they're saying they won't go for just a ceasefire that doesn't have conditions attached to it. They also want any cessation of the war not only to apply to Iran, but to apply to two other fronts of battle, as the Iranians see it, Iraq as well as Lebanon, where the Israelis are increasingly engaged in ground operations.
Iraq has also been a spectacular failure that's like not getting a lot of attention in this media cycle because there's so much devastation taking place everywhere. But they had to literally do a tactical retreat, a ceasefire, with the Iraqi ground forces, the Shia forces in Iraq, to literally withdraw their troops. Did you see that part?
Yep. And well, part of what's
Iraq has been trying to democratically force the American troops to leave for years now.
And Iraq has been this, it's for essentially since the end of the Iraq War, because Iraq is this kind of desiccated country. It's been a place where a lot of different militia groups and a lot of other non-state political and military forces, drive events on the ground. The U.S. viewed it as essentially it went from being its own place and its own war to then becoming a kind of soft proxy battleground against Iran. And now, we'll see. I haven't read anything in depth about the total, how Washington takes the total situation.
U.S. forces are now limited to the Kurdistan region, according to the Iraqi resistance, and they moved many of their troops into Jordan, I think. This is devastating for again, American military superiority, American might, American force projection capabilities. American and NATO forces asked the Iraqi government for a temporary 24-hour ceasefire with the Iraqi resistance factions to facilitate their withdrawal from Victory Base in Baghdad, according to spokesperson for Soraya Avliya. Al-Dam Abu Mahdi al-Jafari. Al-Jafari said that most resistance factions that received the Iraqi government's request agreed to the truce on the condition that popular mobilization sites from the holy city of Samarra to Karbala would not be targeted. But if you return to sin, we will return to punishment. Beast mode.
That is pretty hard.
Beast mode. This has reverberations across the entire world. The reason why I say this is because the American military presence as a force projection capability is everywhere all at once. All of a sudden, this changes the calculation in the Philippines, for example. This changes the calculation of like how well America could safeguard the bulwark against communism in South Korea. This changes the domestic considerations in South Korea for the South Korean government. All of a sudden, they're more willing to bargain as equal partners with the DPRK. If the Filipino government is also smart enough to recognize that reality, they have a very different opinion about getting into a bilateral security commitment with China in the South China Sea. They're the only country there's a holdout in the Asian cooperative structure that has refused to leftist copelam out. Oh my God. American troops are shitting in their fucking diapers. NATO also evacuated. Wait, what? Leftist copelam out? It's weird that I can't tell if you're like making a joke or if you're being serious. As I was saying, the Philippines are the only country in the Asian system that has not engaged with China. Okay? They're the only country in that system that is a holdout. What do they continue? Do they have a real belief that America will defend them if it's no longer Iran, but now we're talking about China? It's just not going to work.
Very heavy bombing. Hezbollah, which Israel had said was wiped out, has been launching dozens upon dozens of rockets every single day into Israel. So they want those two countries also to be party to this ceasefire deal. They're also saying that they want reparations paid by the United States, and they want Israel to pay, but they don't want Israel to pay directly. They want that to happen through the United States because they don't want to take anything directly from Israel. But the other thing, and this is, I think very relevant, and many people, I know you've made this point before, and I've heard other smart analysts make it, that because of the way the United States and Israel have lied about the negotiations, have used it as a veneer or a cover to then wage these wars, the Iranian position has hardened. And what Iran is saying now is that there will be no discussion on its ballistic missile program, that if there is a ceasefire, Iran is going to move rapidly to continue its ballistic missile program, recognizing that it's its only deterrent against the United States and against Israel. They're also saying, and they wouldn't go into more detail on this, that they're in the process of developing a new doctrine on the nuclear question. They didn't say, we're going to go and we want to enrich uranium to make nuclear weapons. But what they're saying to me is that that because of the U.S. and Israel targeting their nuclear infrastructure, because they blew up the negotiations where the Iranians had put terms on the table that went beyond the Obama-era deal, they're saying now that they're having discussions about developing a new nuclear doctrine, potentially in partnership with Russia and China.